Honorable Vivian Balakrishnan, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore, Your Excellencies, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, the chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, for inviting me to the South Asian Diaspora Convention of 2016, and also giving me an opportunity to say a few words in this important plenary session. Actually, following Minister Balakrishnan's very incisive speech, there is very little unique insight that I can shed on the geopolitics of South Asia. But one specific lens perhaps I could offer is that of Indian Ocean's island states, Sri Lanka, which is also the South Asian state with the largest per capita diaspora population. From Sri Lanka's perspective, South Asian geopolitics is closely intertwined with Indian Ocean geopolitics. These two overlapping regions are inextricably linked, and K.M. Panikar, the late Indian diplomat and historian, correctly identified the Indian subcontinent as a quintessential rimland, that is, a region whose fundamental interests and future are tied to their coastlines and seas beyond. By using this appellation, Panikar was emphasizing that the Indian subcontinent divided from the Asian hinterland by the Himalayas is, whether it likes it or not, geographically destined to look outward onto the Indian Ocean rather than inwards into Tibet or Central Asia. And of course, over centuries, even millennia, this fact of nature has resulted in the subcontinent becoming the central node of trading links, cultural connections, and diasporic communities that constitute the web of the Indian Ocean world. As a result, today, there is little doubt that the Indian Ocean is of central, if not preeminent, significance to South Asia. In turn, at this time of global transitional, as our unipolar world is on the wane with the rise of China and India, the Indian Ocean is quickly becoming a theater of global geopolitical interest and, of course, a theater of potential rivalry. As such, it would be a great ironical tragedy if Asia's hard-won independence, economic development, and rising living standards led to conflict and violence rather than peace and stability. Therefore, it is our collective responsibility to identify and implement ways and means of ensuring that Asia's rise creates the condition for regional and global stability. Such thought and action is of principal importance during this period of flux when the old order is being cast aside, but the new order, I believe, has yet to emerge. This period of strategic opportunity brings with it the prospect of putting in place the framework of values, as Minister Balakrishnan mentioned a little while ago, principles, norms, conventions, and of course the institutions necessary for a peace well before the mortar had dried on a faulty foundation. This responsibility is made all the more acute as it is the first time that we Asians will be key players in determining the architecture of our regional maritime order, which has been controlled by external powers, more or less, since Alfonso of Albuquerque made the Indian Ocean a Portuguese lake in the early 16th century. We in Sri Lanka have learned our lessons the hard way. After years of violent conflict, which has created such a large, diverse, and vibrant Sri Lankan diasporic community across the globe, we know that creating rules developed by legitimate, representative, and inclusive institutions and imbued with universal values is essential for peace and stability. And I welcome the minister's speech where he again stressed the need for a rules-based order. I don't think it would be naive to say that, like in Sri Lanka, in a very fundamental sense, parties with an interest in the Indian Ocean have a greater convergence of interests than divergence. Interdependence between economies and peoples is at historically unprecedented highs. There is growing understanding that trade is imperative for development, and there is little appetite for risking an optimistic future to conflict and instability. In addition, there is also very specific instances where interests converge. For example, both India and China have a shared concern with keeping the Hormuz and Red Sea choke points open for free maritime passage. In this context of macro convergence and limited micro convergence, a framework for regulating power in the Indian Ocean and beyond is required. Of course, such a framework must be flexible enough to respond to strategic changes. For example, if unexpectedly fast Indian growth shifts the regional balance of power, but it must also effectively constrain, channel, and process the exercise of power. First, such a framework will need to maintain and uphold a rules-based international order and the principles that undergird them. It is very order that has so successfully prevented the global conflict since the Second World War, provided a sense of security for millions of people living in small states such as mine, and perhaps most importantly, providing the bedrock for our unprecedented collective economic prosperity. Preserving the sovereignty of states, including their sovereign right to pool sovereignty and share it, must naturally be a cornerstone of any framework for peaceful development. And in the context of the Indian Ocean, ensuring peaceful development requires a stable maritime environment, including the freedom of navigation and unimpeded commerce in accordance with international law. Naturally, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which was significantly shaped by Sri Lankans such as the late Shirley Amarasinghe, is an integral part of this framework. But there are many other global commons and areas of connectivity, such as the environment where rules-based systems at the global and regional level become even more necessary in the future. Great care must also be taken to ensure that rules are perceived to be legitimate and institutions that create and enforce them are inclusive and representative. They must be accepted by all the major stakeholders, by the haves and the have-nots, and they must have the consent of both the strong and the weak. Whether we like it or not, global and regional bodies need to take into consideration balances of power, whether economic or otherwise. Failure to do so, ladies and gentlemen, will lead to parallel competing bodies or norms and ultimately lead to institutional instability and stress on the norms and rules that has served us so well. Such a framework is unlikely to amount to much without a common set of values. One useful starting point for the development of common values for the Indian Ocean region and beyond, perhaps, is the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence outlined at the Colombo Power Conference over half a century ago. The values underlying these principles can provide a starting point for updating and expanding the 5 principles to reflect the realities of an increasingly interconnected and interdependent and complex world where the Westphalian concept of sovereignty is, I believe, becoming more and more irrelevant. This brings me to my second point and final point, interdependence. Perhaps more than any conscious design, the effect of technological innovation and globalization have helped us avert conflict. We need to continue to build interdependence into our regional and global frameworks. Increasing economic interdependence between East Asia and South Asia, both through bilateral and mega trade deals like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, can play an important role in strategically stabilizing the region. Improve sea, air, and land connectivity through smarter regulation and greater investment in connectivity could also be an important catalyst. In this context, the Maritime Silk Road, the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor, and other initiatives are very welcome, especially if they can provide a transparent, rules-based, inclusive, institutionalized, and principled means of facilitating cooperative development. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude by noting that building understanding and confidence is a tremendous task that will require great courage, political will, and perseverance. But we have a useful example in the region in the form of ASEAN. Both South Asia and East Asian countries have a great deal to learn from this example as we navigate the transitions in the short, medium, and long terms. And just as Singapore has over the years helped stakeholders come together and work towards their common interests in Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, the gateway to South Asia, which is also fast becoming the hub of the Indian Ocean, and who maintains excellent relations with all relevant stakeholders, too will play a constructive role in promoting dialogue and cooperation for peaceful development in the region. I thank you.